Welcome to the Communicating Earth podcast by Climate Acceptance Studios, the podcast by and for climate and nature communicators. This week it gives me great pleasure because Kris de Meyer is the main reason that this podcast exists. I first came across his 2020 paper, Transforming the Stories We Tell About Climate Change from Issue to Action, when I was helping to set up an advocacy campaign in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow back in 2021. Kris, he's a neuroscientist, he's a science communicator, he's a science policy co-production expert. He's also director of the Climate Action Unit at UCL, University College London, and he's a senior research fellow in the Faculty of Mathematical and Physical Sciences. Kris brings his insights from neuroscience and psychology into how we tell stories about climate change, communicate about climate risk, and create opportunities for climate action. He recently did a TED Talk on how to stop feeling stuck on climate change. Kris, welcome.
Thanks, Tom, for these words. My gosh, it makes me feel very self-conscious.
I hope not. So how was the TED Talk? How did that come about?
Good. I mean, I died on stage. It's not visible in the way that they cut the video afterward, but I died on stage. It's not an easy thing to do, so for sure.
I can imagine. But the edited version, do you think it had the desired effect? Has it inspired more people to action?
Yes, absolutely. I am constantly seeing tags on LinkedIn these days of people that reference it, or where someone references someone else who's mentioned the TED Talk, and so it's starting to really spread and embed itself across the ecosystem of people who are trying to do something about climate change.
Yeah, I think there's definitely this step change. I'm noticing it in the community in which I work about moving away from raising awareness more towards agency and advocacy, but we'll talk about that more later. Okay, so firstly, let's do a bit of identification. So do you consider yourself an activist, a campaigner, an advocate, an environmentalist? I mean, how do you define yourself?
I don't think I see myself as an advocate or a campaigner.
Okay.
I see myself as someone who tries to get action on climate change going, but by activating the agency we already have. Actually, this is a really interesting question because it takes us immediately into the psychology of things. Albert Bandura, who was the social psychologist who came up with a theory of agency, a theory of understanding what makes people feel they can act in a certain situation, he made a distinction between three different flavors of agency. He said there's individual agency, that's when you know how to do something. There is proxy agency, when you don't know how to do something, and so you then start acting, you become an advocate for other people taking action that you think can solve a problem. Or a collective agency, where you discover how to do something together that you can't do on your own. And from my perspective, campaigning and advocacy is proxy agency. It's where people say, like, well, I can't make this change happen. It's the politicians, it's the business leaders, it's the whoever else has more power than I. And that's perfectly fine for people to want to do this, but it wouldn't be enough if, even if all of us were to become advocates and campaigners, we still wouldn't be sure that action on climate change will happen, because even the people who are in positions of power need to have the agency, need to know how to make the change happen. And a lot of the work that we do is in that space. It's with people who have some professional capacity to make change happen, but who don't feel that they can do more than they're already doing. And so helping them to discover how to do more is what we are doing. So, long answer to your question. I see myself as an enabler of action, an enabler of agency in myself, in other people, in society.
When people say, what's the most that I can do as an individual? On the one hand, I think it's been proven, that it's basically going vegan. That's the biggest individual action, because animal agriculture is 15% of emissions, land degradation, methane. being burped by cows and so on. But I would also argue that what you can do actually is to be that advocate, is to be that person influencing politicians. I mean, what you say to that in that sort of not conflict, but relationship between individual action and how the individual impacts collective action?
Every one of us has an ability to make action happen in the context in which we feel confident and the context in which we're operating well. For some of us, that is in the choices that we make in our own lives, whether we stop eating meat and become vegan, whether we change the way that we're transport and moving around. But for quite a few of us, there are also other action possibilities out there. One is, for example, in the community. What role do we play in the community in which we are living, where we might find an action that is really resonating with us, that we hadn't thought about before? So some years ago during lockdown, I did a session online with people in Canada, and half a year later, I got this email back from a person who was in that session, and he said, ever since I attended that session, I was really thinking about what I could be doing, and then I found this place where I could do something that felt meaningful to me, which was sort of like nature conservation in my own community. And I started to do this, and now I am so happy because I found my action. I found my mojo in what I can be doing. So I'm not saying go all do nature conservation. I'm saying that for each of us, there is a thing out there that feels meaningful to get stuck into in relation to the challenges that we're dealing with. And so for some of us, that's in our professional context. If we're working in a job where we can make change happen in the company or the government department or the local authority or the organization where we work in, that's one place where you can find your action. Advocacy in a non-adversarial way is something that other people might find meaningful. I know that there are people who find adversarial advocacy or activism meaningful. That's not for me, but I know that for some people that will be a meaningful thing to do. So each of us have this ability to find a thing that we can change that will contribute to the bigger goal of us trying to tackle climate change as a society.
It's such a tightrope to walk. I mean, the basic thing is do something. Whatever you do something. At the very least, just do something. And let's not get poleaxed by being overwhelmed by the overall situation. Okay, so let's talk about you. Let's talk about is there a specific moment or a story or a tale of action that you can tell us about?
Yeah, and because of course in the work that I do in the climate action unit is this idea that actions drive beliefs and action inspires action. Once you start doing, you discover more and more what you can do. And I would have hundreds of stories from my own life where I saw one action lead to the next, or from the people that we are working with. But I'll pick one of my very first climate actions that I would think of now perhaps as my first real climate action that set me in a direction of where I am today, which is it's 2008 and I'm sitting in front of the TV and I'm flicking through the channels with the remote as we were still doing in those days because it was pre-Netflix and pre-Amazon Prime and all of that stuff. So one evening I'm home and I'm just watching TV, and I happen across this documentary which looks like it's about climate change. And I start following it a little bit, and it turns out that it's a climate skeptical documentary. It is not a documentary about the climate science, it is a climate skeptical one that was going out on primetime UK television at that time.
Channel 4, right? I remember that.
Yes,
I remember it.
let's not name the documentary. We don't need to give it more airtime than it got back in the day. But yes, it was Channel 4 doing that. So as I'm watching this, two things happened inside me. The first one is that I got very angry because I very quickly understood how misleading the arguments were that people who were being interviewed in the documentary were were seeming as they were putting on screen, and at the same time because I was already interested in the neuroscience of polarization in those days, I also understood this is actually going to be very persuasive and believable to people who don't know the science that well about climate change or who don't know how science operates. Um, and so I was really sitting there and thinking, what can I do? What can I do? And the one thing that as a scientist I was very comfortable with was writing to other scientists. So while the documentary is happening, I start already Googling some of the people that were being interviewed in the documentary, and I started to email them. Hey, this documentary is going out on Channel 4. It looks as if you're saying this and this and this in that documentary. Um, why are you doing this? And so the next day I got an email back from one of them where he went like, oh my gosh, I got bombarded by emails yesterday from people who saying like, what are you doing in this documentary? It looks as if I was misrepresented. That the things that I was said were basically in the edit room switched around and it makes it look as if I'm saying something different from what I'm actually saying. And so I thought like, oh, that's interesting. If that one person that responded already has that kind of feeling of being misrepresented, then maybe other people will be the same. So I emailed more and more of them. And the interesting thing is that I got a response back from them where some of them were like, hey, yeah, we weren't represented correctly. And to other people who said the documentary is not without faults, but actually it's a good counterweight against a lot of the climate misinformation or they didn't use the phrase misinformation. They used the propaganda that is going out there from things like inconvenient truth and everything. To then people who said like, no, this is a very good documentary and climate science is all wrong. And the interesting thing is that most of the people that I was writing to were scientists. Some of them were even at that time still publishing climate scientists. And what I got from it, two things. The first one is it was my first action that made me really take that first step in doing a very specific climate driven action at that moment. But I took it from my own area of agency and being able to know how to do a certain thing, which was writing to scientists in a way that you get a response from them. And the second thing that I realized is, well, if they can even find people who are publishing climate scientists to make an argument of that type, then this idea of how the polarization and the neuroscience of the polarization plays a role in the societal debate about climate change is very, very important. And so that's when I became super interested in climate change as a debate that started to polarize more and more in the subsequent years.
So when you had those responses, those surprising responses from the ones who were saying that we're just balancing the arguments, I mean, did you carry on the conversation? Was there anything that was, dare I say it, controversial or confrontational? Did you try and sort of win the argument over, win hearts and minds?
Well, with some of them I did, and the interesting thing was that some of them were really abusive, and I didn't have a conversation with them. But I remember one at least where I had a conversation about the concerns that that person had to come to their point of view. And those were concerns that I understood. That person was concerned about poverty in society and felt that climate change was taking away, or a focus on climate change was taking away from alleviating poverty and lifting people out of poverty. And so, despite the fact that we disagreed on the effectiveness of the different ways to respond to poverty, we had a thing in common in that we were concerned about, hey, this is what happening to poor people and da 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 da. So you can find common ground even with people who then come to different conclusions based on a concern that they have.
Do you think you've got a particular talent in being persuasive and winning hearts and minds just in your day-to-day action because of your background in studying behavioral science?
Yes, and I'm gonna be deliberately pushing back against what you just said in the sense of like by not trying to persuade. Like one thing I learned from the early 2000s when I got interested in this neuroscience of polarization was that there was not a thing that I could say in certain situations that would persuade people. But by listening to them, by asking questions and listening, I could sometimes make progress in understanding them and then connecting to them. So it's not that I'm particularly good at persuading other people of my point of view. It's that I learned to push my point of view to the background in order to understand where another person is coming from and then try to find a connection across something that we have in common with each other. And then the end result of that is that the conversations that I have are more fruitful with people who have a different opinion to myself. The best situation I got to in those early days of social media was that I could get people to move away from the idea that I was an evil person for having a different position to themselves to a place where they thought, oh, you're not evil, but maybe you're very naive. So, because I don't agree with what you're saying. So we ended up having constructive disagreements rather than fistfights on social media, which of course is getting more and more the case that people are just shouting at each other without listening to each other.
Well, I think the climate movement has got so much to learn just from that last interaction. Because, we have right on our side, and there's such a wealth of evidence. And with each passing day, with the latest extreme weather event, it becomes more and more obvious. And I've certainly been guilty of just, losing patience and going, for Pete's sake, can't you see? It's obvious. But that, of course, is going to put people's backs up, isn't it? Maybe with those academics as well, there was pride there, and they were worried about being seen to be duped. Do you think that might have been an element of it?
I don't know. Like the ones who felt duped really expressed that they felt duped, and then the one that was the most um felt the most misrepresented got himself excised from then future showings of the documentary. Um, and with others, I think it's generally like, haven't you had things where you went like, yeah, I'm not completely agreeing with that, but it's okay. It's basically okay what this thing is trying to achieve. I think we all have that, and it's all relevant to our position, the position we inhabit. So all of this just made me aware of how much each of us have a position in the world, and that makes us understand things in a certain way and makes us agree with certain things in a certain way. And yes, against all of the stuff that goes on in people's brains, there is a reality, there is this change of climate, but how people understand that is all dependent on where they are sitting, um, in whatever understanding they've created of the world around them.
Fascinating. And I want to return to it, but I want to now enter a section of the podcast, which we have provisionally, well, more than provisionally, called Quickfire. However, for the first few episodes, it really hasn't been Quickfire. So I'm trying to think of a new name for it, maybe medium paced round. So we'll give it a go. Are you ready,
I
Kris?
will try to be as quick as I can.
What's the first word that springs to mind when I say climate?
Need for action.
Who's your greatest inspiration in your work?
A psychologist called Elliot Aronson.
And do you think their work needs to receive more attention, or is there someone whose work you think needs to receive more attention?
His and everyone who put action at the center of how people operate. Lots of psychology and behavioral science has put thinking at the center of how people operate. There's dozens of traditions across the psychological, human and social sciences that put action at the center of the way that humans operate, but they are not prevalent when it comes to climate change. They occupy little niches in different parts of the research landscape, but they're almost absent when it comes to climate change.
So you referenced earlier An Inconvenient Truth, the Al Gore documentary. But is there another, it's a book or a movie or a TV show, a piece of culture that is your favorite when it comes to the sector?
Yes, I'm going to use an example of the first novel of climate change that I think captures the idea of action building really, or agency building through stories of action really well. And it's called Fairhaven. And it's written by a writer together with an engineer. And the reason why it has lots of stories of action in there is because the engineer was working on the kinds of solutions that are built into the story. Now the story is sort of like we're sitting in 2035 or something like that. Climate change impacts are worse than today. They're more visible than today, but it's not the foreground of the story, it's the background of the story. And the foreground of the story is a bunch of people trying to do things in response to the situation that they're in. And it may not be the best novel in the world, um, but it is the first climate action novel that I have read. I know that people say the same about Ministry for the Future, but it starts with chapters and chapters of people dying as a result of climate impacts. And so I could never get through those chapters to get through the stories where there's a sense of action and a sense of agency building. Fairhaven is different in that it starts with the action.
So this next question, we've already had a number of people say face to face. So I'm going to say, apart from face to face, what's your favorite way of communicating? Your favorite communications channel?
I'm gonna answer that probably slightly unusually. Workshopping something where we are often creating a format in which we might present some information or we might ask some questions, but then for people to start thinking about that, to start working, to start doing things with that, and then come to different insights, to new revelations on the back of things. So rather than broadcasting, than me constantly talking, which of course sometimes I do, but workshopping where you give short bits of information, short stories, short provocations, short questions, and then most of the time people are just working with that and coming up with new insights in response to that.
And is it your favorite because you think it's the most effective?
Yes, because it turns the need for persuasion into creating the abilities for people to persuade themselves and to find the thing in what it is that you are bringing to them where it connects with their concerns and where it connects with the things that they are trying to do. So I'll give some examples of that. We might be running action-based storytelling training, but then we try to do that in this self-persuasive format, whereby people then at some point in the training discover the way that they can make it work for themselves. We might work with government departments. We might organize workshops where we bring scientists and policymakers together, and we take them through a process whereby somewhere in that process they have a penny drop moment and they go like, ah, I had never thought about that thing before. And that's my favorite way of communicating, of interacting with people.
Makes perfect sense. Beautiful little communities, goes all the way back to our forefathers 10,000 years ago on the African plains, doesn't it? It's sort of innate. It's built into our DNA, I think. Um, what's your favorite stat or fact about climate crisis?
One that I put in in the opening sentence of the action-based storytelling paper, that when I wrote this, 98% of all the stories about climate and environment were negative in nature. And it's not simply about it being negative versus positive. It's about it being describing the problem rather than describing what we should do to tackle the problem. And so that's a stat that was really it's central to the work that we are doing in that, first of all, I've seen the number go down. It's not 98% anymore. Maybe now there is 5 or 10% of the stories that are about climate and environment that are much more focusing on the things we should be doing to tackle it than on the problem itself. And the second thing is that I've said that I can retire once that has risen to 80%.
80.
Yeah, 80. So only
Okay.
20, like it will never, the stories about the problem will never go away. But if they drop to 20%, and if we have 80% of stories about the actions we are doing to tackle the problem, then I'll be ready to retire.
I remember there was this thing where we had to find stories of hope, and there was always going to be in any sort of questionnaire or piece of a campaign that'd have to be a story of hope, but it would be very much sort of tagged on at the end within a series of questions we ask an expert. And yeah, 80%, that would be marvelous. So we're living in this age of, I mean, I think people still don't totally appreciate how amazingly well funded and well thought through this fossil fuel PR machine that we all are enslaved to. Within that, there are endless myths, climate misconceptions. If there's just one that you could permanently retire, make sure that everybody realized it was rubbish, what would that be?
That climate change is a problem that we need to pay for to make it go away. We call this, in technical language, the abatement cost mindset. So, abatement cost is a concept that was dreamed up by consultants probably 20, 30 years ago, which is like you need to pay to decarbonize the system. You need to, you need to dedicate a certain amount of money to get rid of emissions in this sector. That is useful in and of itself. But what has not been useful is that a mindset that related to this idea has become endemic amongst everyone. Whereas when we think about other areas of investment, like when you make a decision to buy a house or to buy a car or a bicycle or anything that you value in your life, you are not framing it in those you need to pay this cost to make that problem go away. So the cost of a house is not a payment to avoid you from sleeping on the street. You invest in a house in order to have a good life with your family and yourself. You invest in transport so that you can get around. You don't invest in transport as an in a negative way. So this idea that climate change is a cost that needs to be carried by society in order for the problem to go away is unhelpful. And what would be much more helpful is to think about how do we build a better future for everyone, and the investment that we are putting in that better future through, for example, uh, energy provision for everyone through the deployment of renewables, for example, and will bring energy to everyone far cheaper, etc., than it has been in the past. That's an investment in the future. And so, if we could turn away this myth from climate change is a problem that we need to pay to make it go away into let's invest in the future and let's make action on climate change the side effect of that investing in a better future for everyone, that would be a much better framing for us to think in.
That is brilliant. We've got to spread that word, spread that framing word, Kris.
Yes, we are trying.
Finally, in the medium-paced round, is there a go-to analogy or metaphor that you use to explain the predicament that we're currently in as a species?
I am always thinking of a bottleneck in the sense of we are in a place now, and I know this is going to sound really, lots of people might be disagreeing with this, but we are living in a pretty good time. Like life expectancy for people, we are living in a pretty good time for people. Life expectancy is high. Yes, we've got wars at the moment that are terrible, but we had more terrible wars in the past. We had more famine in the past. People were dying a lot earlier in life, etc. So we're living in a pretty good time. we are at risk of going back to times that are far less good. And maybe in the last 10, 15 years, we have already seen some declines in society. Um, but we've got that bottleneck. And if we can squeeze through that bottleneck, we can come out at the end of that in a better position than where we are today. And certainly a better position than where we're heading if we don't take that action. So it'll be very tight. It's not guaranteed we'll squeeze through it, but we've got to do everything that we can to get to that place where there is more um, prosperity, not richness, more prosperity for people around the globe, where there is less suffering for people around the world, where nature is better respected, and all of those things. And I think we can do that. We've never been in a better position to do it than today, with everything we know about human nature and everything we know about ourselves, etc.
So there you go. You're contributing now to increasing and reaching that target of 80% with that answer. Thank you. Okay, so let's return back to the Tale of Action from 2008. So what was the impact after it was all over? You emailed a bunch of your peers, that some responded favorably, some didn't. What were the immediate effects of that?
Because of the responses I got from the scientists and because of that wide range of responses from that small selection of scientists in that documentary, I got thinking about like what else can I do? And I was friends with a filmmaker in those days. I'm still friends with her, but we started to then think about like how could you use documentary to do something about this problem? So we proposed a number of different things to the broadcasters. Like one documentary idea was about taking a bunch of ordinary people around all of the places in the UK where climate research is happening to help people to understand what that research is doing and what it is showing and all of that. That didn't get made. But then on the back of trying to get that made, I understood something about how important that sense of understanding and belief and conviction that people can have with regards to whatever their position is and how strongly convinced and entrenched they can become in their point of view, that we then ended up making a documentary about that. And it's called Right Between Your Ears. It was finished in 2016. We started in 2011, like typical independent documentary. It took a long time to make. But the reason why I mention it is that it's the trunk of everything that I'm doing today. And the insights, the psychological insights into belief formation and how people deal with having to change their beliefs, etc., that sits in that documentary is the basis for everything that we are doing today, including the actions drive beliefs and the action inspires action. Because I learned from spending 6 weeks with a group of people who believed the end of the world was going to happen, and then it didn't happen. So that's the subject of the story of the documentary. But psychologically, I learned from them that actions drive beliefs, that the actions they were taking were changing the belief and the understanding they had and were increasing their agency. So all of that psychological theory that existed, of which Aronson and Bandura, two names that I've already mentioned, are core architects of that, all of that came to life for me in that documentary. Or in the period that we spend with those people. So that little bit of me emailing those scientists had very, very big consequences because everything I'm doing today, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, even in my dreams, is all informed by the action that I took at that time and how those actions started to build my own agency to do more and more in this domain.
At the risk of getting a bit Freudian, tell me about one of your dreams. Where are
Um,
you dreaming or working your dreams?
Well, during lockdown, I had this dream that I was part of a Starfleet in Star Trek, and that I
Okay.
was responsible for decarbonizing Starfleet. So that is one of those places where, but much more often is much more mundane. That the solution to a problem that we need to solve in a workshop or something might come to me just before I fall asleep or just when I wake up or sometimes even in my dreams. I sometimes dream about the workshops that I have to give the next week.
Whenever I talk about, the future that I want, I always say us working towards the Star Trek, the next generation future that we all want. That's always my cultural reference point. Okay, so our audience is climate and nature communicators, people whose job it is to communicate the climate and nature crisis to their audiences, be it policymakers or be it the public. So how would you see the future of that sector? What would you like to see them doing?
Pivot towards telling the stories of what we are doing to tackle these crises rather than thinking that you need to communicate the problem itself. Like, you can communicate about the problem, but you can also do so specifically through telling stories of what your organization, your sector, your ecosystem is doing to tackle that problem. And we see this message catching on. And I've had conversations with people working in that sector. Sometimes a half-hour conversation is enough for them to shift their practice, where they go like, we started to do this and it changed our lives. We are not trying to explain the problem anymore. We are talking about the things we are doing to tackle the problem. And it still allows us to explain the problem, but through the action. So we've got, in every language that I know, we've got sayings that capture this, right? Actions speak louder than words. So stories of action are better to explain the problem than trying to explain the problem in an abstract way.
I mean, I've worked with some of the leading international climate science research institutes. So, can you give me more detail around them? Like, what should I say to them? Because I have the ability to have half-hour conversations, and indeed I do regularly with the people who head up the communications team within organizations like that, who have yet again commissioned another, beautifully constructed, amazing report on their particular vertical, explaining in another way how screwed we are. So, how do they, people who are in that, in that channel of report, conference appearance, webinar, report, conference appearance, webinar, repeat, how would you kick them out of, or maybe enhance that overall process?
Yeah, so that's such a brilliant question. And the first work that I started to do in the climate space specifically was working with scientists, give them science communication training. But like very quickly, that work started to focus that on the fact that for them too, there are action stories possible. So if you move outside of the domain of environmental and climate science, when you get scientists to communicate, they will usually communicate about the things they are doing as scientists. The astrophysicists and the physicists and astronomists and whatever who are looking for particles or distant planets or whatever, they talk about the things they are doing. They don't talk about the concerns so much or the why they are doing things. That's always like the second part of their story. But they will first start explaining to you what it is that they're doing. In the climate and the environmental space, scientists are not talking about what they are doing. They are talking about the why of the doing. They are talking about you should be concerned because of da 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 da. But that's sort of like the conclusion of all of the work that they are doing, the research that they are doing. And when you do that, you then fall into that trap of trying to persuade people of the importance of your conclusion. Instead of that, the climate science community, again, 80% of their time could communicate about the things they are doing to understand what the problems are, the research that they are carrying out. And so when I did this with, like I've done this many, many times with PhD students who are early on in their career, and when we ran an activity where we got them to talk about the things they are doing, lots of little stories pop up. Like some of them might be studying little ecosystems or particular animals or particular plants. Some of them might be going on the ocean. Some of them might be going to the Arctic or Antarctic. So there's a whole diversity of stories there. If you just get them to talk about climate change or biodiversity loss, they all sound the same. If you get them to tell their story of their individual bits of research that they are doing, then you get a story of action of a researcher that helps people to understand the bigger picture. Of course, there are still those situations where science communities or science organizations are asked to produce a report that is factual and evidence based. Um, and even there, in those situations, we are then, these days, we are often doing work in that space where we are really trying to help the scientists to understand how to make scientific information actionable for the audience that you are writing it for. So if the IPCC needs to produce an assessment of the scientific information, how can it actually help policymakers do their job differently? At the moment, the way the IPCC report is written, it doesn't allow that very much. And so a few years ago, we ran a workshop for the UK government, bringing together people from the science and the policy side of the IPCC together to explore that question: how can the outputs become more actionable? So, and within that workshop, these individual penny drop moments happened, as I described before. Now, we then wrote a whole report with recommendations and all of that that sits somewhere on the website of the relevant government department. But I'm mentioning this as an example of how, even for scientists who need to produce facts and evidence and risk-based information, there are ways to ask the question: what do I want a person to do with this information? Not just what I want them to know. At the moment, everyone is focused on what do I want people to know about this problem? And instead of that, if you start with the question, what do I want people to be able to do with that information? You might come up with a different way to tell the stories.
So you're saying focus on the how of the research as much as the why.
Yes, absolutely.
Very good. Very good. I'm going to stop tomorrow in my next call with one of my clients. What do you think is the most important message that the public needs to hear? So obviously we've got this overall principle of like everyone's got to take action. So that's fine. So is that the most important message, or can you think of something else? Maybe it goes back to the start of the podcast when we said just do something. Everyone has to do something.
Yeah, someone else said, like, if I can summarize your TED talk in 3 words, it would be put action first. And I was like, yes, I can live with that. So put action first in what you are doing or how you are relating to climate change. Even if it's the tiniest thing that you can do in the way that you make a change in your own life, or you go into a community, you do something with a community, or you find something else to do at a level of your country or your job or whatever role you occupy, you will be part of the solution. And it's only if all of us or most of us become part of the solution that we will be cracking this problem.
I think that's a terrific ending. Thanks, Kris. And we always like to ask this last question just to give a sense that you are a professional out there and you are yourself taking action. So, what's the next thing on your to-do list this afternoon? What have you got after this recording session?
I am going to, let me have a look at. My calendar is here next to me. I have 3 more conversations today one about climate change and theater, the other one about climate change and risk games, using games to get the risks of climate change across. And the other one is about our own organization's ability to do more. So this is like everything I do on a day-to-day basis is focused on how can we do more.
Very good. Well, look, Kris, I really appreciate your time. And for everyone out there, his work, well, for me, has been truly inspirational and has been the thing that sowed the seed for this very podcast that you're listening to. So there's lots more information in the notes below about Kris's work. I strongly advise you to read it thoroughly because I think it might transform the way in which you do your work and the impact that you have on the world. But again, Kris, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.